I'm usually not a big fan of page-to-screen adaptations. The message never feels quite the same. They're two really contrasting mediums, and the transition between them is rarely perfect. But there is one film that completely turned its source material on its head, and in my opinion, significantly improved upon it through its reinvention. That is The 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade and its film counterpart, Salo. Pier Paolo Pasolini takes an extremely controversial novel, and by changing its setting and context, creates what is, in my interpretation, one of the most impactful pieces of political art in modern history. It shines compared to previous adaptations of Sade's work. Take Justine, one of his novels adapted by Jesus Franco. It's made up almost entirely of softcore porn and gratuitous violence. Salo has sex, violence, and sexual violence, but treats it in a much more complex and relevant way. The basic story shared between these two is of four wealthy, powerful men who decide to take their desires to their extremes, kidnapping a harem of young teens as well as gathering four old prostitutes. These women tell their stories to excite the four men, and they enact whatever horrific sexual fantasies they have onto the children over the course of 120 days. Quite the graphic story we have on our hands. But if you read the novel and watch the film, even though they follow the same plot, you'll quickly realize that these are in fact fundamentally opposing stories. One of the key changes made in Pasolini's adaptation is the story's setting, and this alteration has a domino effect, creating many more differences between the two versions. The novel, 120 Days of Sodom, was written by the Marquis de Sade in 1785, shortly before the French Revolution, and that's where the story is set. Our protagonists, if you can call them that, are wealthy French aristocrats. These are the people who, in that time, had the most power, hence why they're able to commit the atrocities they do. In Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salo, on the other hand, the story's events take place in the titular city, Salo, a very important choice. For those of you not caught up on your fascist history, Salo was the de facto capital of Benito Mussolini's state. Although it's not specified, the film's time period can be placed around the end of Mussolini's rule. Watching the film, given this context, and seeing the way that it critiques fascism, this location is a finger pointed straight at the regime with no shyness whatsoever. In this iteration of the story, the four psychopaths still technically hold the same social roles: bishop, president, duke, and magistrate. Still, the significance of their titles is different in this setting. They have armies and governments on their side. For example, in both the film and the novel, the kidnapping of the children is a significant moment in the story, but their setting means that they're handled very differently. In the novel, the children are kidnapped quietly. In the film, the kidnapping takes on an institutional tone. The children have already been picked up, taken away by soldiers. They're brought together to be inspected and selected in broad daylight. There is no secrecy here. This is also reflected in the more specific details of their location. In the book, the Mansion of Horrors is in a forest, locked away and hidden so as to never be found. In the film, the villa where the atrocities take place is bright and in the middle of the city. It stands out. On top of that, the outside is always shot in bright daylight. There's absolutely nothing hidden about it. This represents the fact that in Italy at the time, the libertines could have done whatever they liked without having to worry about getting caught, because everyone would turn a blind eye. There is nothing anyone could do to stop them. Who would even stop them? They were in the capital, running the country. Therefore, the director turns the villa into a microcosm of contemporary Italy. There's one scene that does not exist at all within the book that Pasolini added, and it's my favorite scene in the film. One of the young boys is said to be punished, and in order to avoid suffering, he betrays that another victim is breaking the rules. She in turn betrays another, and so on and so forth until one of the soldiers is caught sleeping with the Black Servant. When the libertines find him, he stands proud and with his fist in the air, before they shoot him and the maid dead. This scene represents the era of political tension in Italy at the time, when rules were tight and people would betray each other to protect themselves when they should have all been sticking together through the horrors. On a slightly less depressing note, although that's hard to do given the subject matter, The formatting is another interesting difference between the two mediums. In both cases, they are split into 4 parts, each increasing the intensity of the torture experienced by the young victims. In 120 Days of Sodom, the novel, these sections are titled Simple Passions, Complex Passions, Criminal Passions, and Murderous Passions. These frame the different levels of torture as increasing in intensity of pleasure. Pasolini takes this, flips it on his head, and adds a layer of Italian culture to it, structuring the film around Dante's Inferno. His 4 sections are titled Antiferno, Circle of Manias, Circle of Shit, and Circle of Blood. The comparison to Dante's Inferno indicates, in opposition to the book, an increasing level of suffering and pain. The place is literally compared to hell. This takes the point of view from the libertines and to the victims, centering their experience more than that of the perpetrators. These differences indicate a larger thematic change in the adaptation from the book to the film. In the novel, the 4 libertines are philosophers exploring the possibilities of pleasure. The style of writing invites the reader in as a willing voyeur. It invites you to enjoy what is on display. To put some historical context to this, a lot of Sade's writing, this novel included, is based heavily on his own experience. He beat, tortured, and raped young boys and girls his entire life. Pasolini, on the other hand, had very different intentions with this film. He started work on Salo as a reaction to what he saw around him in Italy. The 1960s and 70s were a time of marked violence and stress. Pasolini despised what the culture had become, and he despised that criminals, people who had committed horrible crimes, were permitted to walk around with no shame simply because they were powerful. This film was his way of putting his societal critiques and observations on display. That is why he depicts such extreme human suffering with no mercy. Unlike Sade, he does not sexualize the victims. They are scared, hurt children being tossed around by monsters. The most common reason why people dislike this film is obviously because of the violence, but that very brutality that's so heavily criticized was the point. This is not a film you're supposed to enjoy. And believe me, some people really didn't enjoy it, because 3 weeks before its release at the Paris Film Festival, Pasolini was brutally attacked, beaten, and murdered in a scene that could have been taken straight out of his own film. It's unclear whether the film itself instigated the attack, but what we can say for sure is that the neo-fascists of Italy did not like Pasolini's strong political stance, and Salo might very well have been his most outspoken moment. Do with that information what you will.